to be on 4, and we should just sprung that on me this week. I want to talk a little bit today about freedom of speech, because obviously it's the reason we all get to be here today. But it's also the spurious justification given by David Gray and his colleagues at Sheffield International Venues for allowing this event that we're all here to protest to go ahead, regardless of its impact on our communities. It hardly needs saying that freedom of expression is important. Free speech laws allowed us to criticise the king, or the government, or the church, without fear of being arrested or imprisoned. They allowed scientists like Charles Darwin to propose radical new theories, driving forward freedom of thought and with it our understanding of the world. Without free speech, we might never have seen the decriminalisation of homosexuality, the end of Section 28, the Gender Recognition Act, or the introduction of civil partnerships and later equal marriage. Our Muslim friends would be unable to practice their religion, to celebrate its festivals, or to wear their traditional dress. But whilst the good that has come of this privilege is fairly obvious, all too often in the social media age, free speech is corrupted to serve as a shield for those disseminating divisive, dangerous and damaging ideas that target the most vulnerable among us. To take but one example of this, the current onslaught against trans people in the press and on social media, the deliberate misgendering, the egregious mischaracterisation of trans people as sexual predators hell-bent on grooming young people, the reheated, recycled homophobia barely altered from 30 years ago, but re-weaponised to direct at a group that are now sadly seen as a more socially acceptable target. All dressed up in the language of legitimate concerns and their right to be expressed. But free speech, like any other right, is not and cannot be absolute. There are numerous necessary limitations that exist to prevent one person's right to speak, to write or to publish freely, causing harm to others. So when we hear that a man who has described gay people as the enemy, who has claimed that LGBT people are responsible for a moral 9/11, who calls us evil and wicked, who warns the American public that children and their grandchildren will be at risk to sexual predators and perverts as a result of anti-discrimination laws, and who himself enthusiastically supports Vladimir Putin's laws denying free speech to LGBT people in Russia, is being granted this platform to protect his right to free speech. It's extremely difficult to see how David Gray and SIV can justify this stance. Now, some may and many do argue that it's just words. We have nothing to fear from rhetorical attacks. But as every member of any marginalised community knows, words have consequences. Our words have the power to persuade, to invoke emotion, to confirm our biases or to challenge them, to inspire, to influence and to incite. There's no more perfect example of this than when Boris Johnson published one of his turgid, badly written articles in the Daily Telegraph, where he likened Muslim women to bank robbers and letterboxers. Now, in the weeks following the publication of that article, attacks against Muslim women increased generally, but with many specifically reporting that they'd had envelopes shoved into their faces. Words have consequences, but if, like Mr. Gray, you're rarely, if ever, on the receiving end of such actions, it might be difficult for you to understand what those consequences are. So let me spell out for Mr. Gray and the SIV right now the impact their decision will have on our community. Hate crimes are on the increase, year on year, and at an alarming rate. Now, this is no surprise, because since we opened the xenophobic Pandora's box of Brexit in 2016, othering and vilification of anyone who's not straight, white, British and able-bodied has become normalised in public debate. So even though Brexit itself relates specifically to our relationship with the European Union, the toxic discourse surrounding it has left not only EU citizens, but non-EU immigrants, Muslims, black and brown British citizens and LGBT people more vulnerable to verbal attacks and physical assault. Words have consequences. We still live in a society where being gay or lesbian or bi or trans or non-binary isn't fully accepted. Sure, we've got equal marriage, but equal marriage was just a step along the road to equality and not the end point that many would have us believe. Children in our classrooms are still bullied at a depressing rate just for being LGBT. LGBT adults still suffer poorer outcomes overall in terms of education, employment, housing and healthcare. And we still face the very real risk of being physically attacked for displaying any kind of public affection, or even just on suspicion of being trans or gay. We still see openly homophobic language and ideas being passed off as one equal side of a legitimate debate, such as the recent situation in Birmingham, where protesters were trying to deny young people the right to even know that LGBT families exist. Young people now, still in 2020, sit alone in their bedrooms, terrified, worrying whether their parents will accept them for who they are, whether their friends will disown them, how they'll be treated by a society that still views us as other than, less than. Rates of depression, self-harm and suicide are still significantly higher amongst LGBT people than they are amongst the general population. And this is no surprise, given everything I just mentioned. So allowing someone who espouses such abhorrent views as Franklin Graham to speak in the city's flagship venue says to that young LGBT person, terrified of coming out for fear of the consequences, that Graham's rhetoric is supported at quite a high level. It tells them that such views are legitimate, that it's okay for them to be aired. It tells them that they have every reason to feel isolated and afraid. And it directly contributes to those disproportionately high rates of mental ill health and self-harm. Not only do our words have consequences, but so do our actions. And the actions of Mr. Gray and his colleagues will have the consequence of making LGBT people in this city and our Muslim friends feel less safe, less supported and less valued. It will have the consequence of emboldening those who would attack us for who we are, normalising their hate and legitimising their bigotry. And it will have the consequence of making those affected by the disgraceful decision to allow this person to speak in our city forever resentful of those who have enabled their continued vilification at his hands. I won't keep you much longer, please. Just want to say one more thing on freedom of speech before I go. And that's that whatever rights we may think we possess to spew this vile and hateful propaganda, no one, absolutely no one, has the right to a platform for such odious views. Or indeed any views. You might broadly agree with what I've said here today, but I have no divine right to be standing here expressing my opinions in this space, on this microphone, to this audience. I'm here at the pleasure of those who organise the event, and not because I'm entitled to be here. So with this in mind, I would call on David Gray and his colleagues in the strongest possible terms to reconsider their position. I urge the SIB to stand with the people of Sheffield, with its LGBT and faith communities, and to compel Franklin Graham to seek a venue more befitting his appalling nature. Like, for example, a derelict public toilet, or an open sewer, or failing any of those, the Oval Office. That's it from me, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike. I think I've got a